Hey crew, it's Pitt and I'm back with some more esoterica. Today we are diving back into the works of Carl Jung. This is Mysterium Coniunctionis. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above and the box down below, along with the original source material, the link for my book, a link for a direct contact with me so that you can get a better understanding of how or why I say the things that I do. In addition to that, I want to take an extra minute just to ask a favor. If you like what is going on over here, if you like the content that we are producing, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow. Throw me a comment whether you agree or disagree. If it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. And if you really like what we're doing, hit the super thanks or the hype button. The super thanks does cost you something, but the hype button is free, and it does help the channel immensely. And so if you find value, I would appreciate it if you would spend your daily hype with me. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of Mysterium Coniunctionis with Salt, Part H, the interpretation and meaning of salt. Salt, as much as ash, is a synonym for the albedo, or dilbatio, which is identical with the white stone, the white sun, the full moon, the fruitful white earth, cleansed and calcined. Footnote 626. That is from Mylius. Salt and ash can absolutely be a direct correlation, right? Ash is just the part that is left over when the fire is done with it. That is the same as the body, right? There is fire inside of it. Once it is done, it will return to salt, and so there is nothing wrong with that allegory. The white stone, the white sun, the full moon, the fruitful white earth, cleansing, calcine, those are all representatives of the Logos, which inhabits your temple but is not the temple, so it is not going to be identical with those. However, the connecting link between ash and salt is potash, and the burning and corrosive property of lye, caustic solution, is well known. 627 is from the Liber de Alimbus del Salibus, attributed to Rhasis or Garlandus. The purely chemical treatise of Arabic origin gives some idea of what the early medieval alchemists knew of chemistry. Potash it comes from a mixture of fat and wood, right? That is, lye comes from that. It is rendered fat mixed with ash, creates lye. All right. Senior mentions that the dialbatio was known as salsatura, marination. Footnote 628. 628 is from De Chemia. All right. Some light is thrown on the numerous overlapping significations of salt, and the obscurity begins to clear up when we are informed further that one of its principal meanings is soul. That is not correct. Salt is the body. It is the temple. It is the corporeal substance. It is neither the spirit nor soul. That is a misattribution at best. Right? And the soul is represented, and the Trinity is salt, mercury, and sulfur. Salt being the body, sulfur being the spirit, the fire, the agent of change, and quicksilver or mercury being the soul. It is not salt as the soul. There is no attribution where that is going to be correct. As the white substance, it is the white woman, and the salt of our magnesia, 629. 629 says, for the alchemist, magnesia was as a rule an arcane substance and not a specifically chemical one. The salt of our magnesia is a spark of anima mundi, 630, and again, that is not going to be correct, from Kuhnroth. The spark of the anima mundi, the part that makes you move, right, that is going to be the spirit. Once again, now, the soul makes the decisions, the spirit carries them out through the 5D navigation device. That is the temple of God in which your soul resides. You are the differentiated piece of God assigned this vessel. You are not the vessel. You are the thing that resides inside the vessel. The soul. There is the conscious soul, which is you thinking, and the unconscious soul, which is kind of God talking to you. Right? When you have unconscious thoughts, that is the divine speaking to you. It is up to you to interpret those, but you interpret those through the soul, the part that thinks. That is synonymous with ego. It is not synonymous with spirit. It is not synonymous with body. Salt is the body. I understand that is a widely contested thing, as we have gone through the last couple of days. We have talked about that quite extensively. Not everybody had a good interpretation of things. That was quite obvious from many of the studies that we have done. Some have it, some don't. If you are associating salt with the spirit, you don't have it. If you are associating it with the soul, you don't have it. It is the body. Now, water is a little bit adjustable, right? Water is body feelings. It is the spiritual side of the body. It is not, however, synonymous with the soul or the spirit either. It is understandable why people use that instead of fire, because when you are manipulating the energies, it is very much like moving water when you are in a pool. Even the feeling is pretty much the same. When you push your arm through the water, right underneath the water, you do the punches and all of those things, and you feel the resistance, and then you feel the flow around it. That is the feeling of moving these energies, right? But they are really air. They are not really, or they're really fire, but they are represented understandably by water, but it is not a good representation. And air is more about the soul than it is even about that. And so it is understandable where these confusions pop up, especially since there is such a abundance of bad information, right? Everything from Cornelius Agrippa pretty much was terrible. That is the common denominator. That is not the unusual thing. It is more common than not that there is not a good understanding. All right, back to the text. For Glauber, the salt is feminine and corresponds to Eve. That is a not great way of looking at it. 631. Die Signatura Salium. For Eve as the feminine element contained in the man. See psychology and religion. I don't know that it is good to attribute either masculine or feminine to the body. It contains both, right? And you may present masculine or you may present feminine. That doesn't really make a whole lot of difference for this, right? I don't know that there is a good attribution for any of them really, right? Body, soul, or spirit as feminine or masculine. They all contain both, and so designating one as is a little bit, right? Now we attribute the void, which is half of the spirit, with feminine, and we attribute the point, which is half of the spirit, with masculine. And it is understandable how you could not see both sides of that and then get confused and attribute to the spirit just one of those. But it is both, in the same way that the physical corporeality is not restricted to one gender, right? I am here, my wife is here. We represent opposites, but we both have a body. There is no real reason to point to either one of those as masculine or feminine. And so using that comparison for me is just a no, right? To say that salt is feminine is just trying to attribute something that does not necessarily need it, right? And even it is much easier to add salt than it is to remove it. The Gloria Mundi says, the salt of the earth is the soul. That is incorrect. 632. Museum Hermetica. And now, once again, that is an important designation. That is an important distinction to make. Salt is physicality. It is not the soul. This pregnant sentence contains within it the whole ambiguity of alchemy. And that is the problem, right? That is one of the things that we are working on getting cleared up around here. Right? The ambiguity, that it could go either way, that there is no real reason to designate. That is why we are doing this. On the one hand, the soul is the aqua permanens, which dissolves and coagulates. That is a little bit closer to truth. The arcane substance, which is at once the transformer and the transformed, that is not, right? Now, as that which dissolves and coagulates by direction of will, that would be the soul, right? You make the decision, I am going to dissolve this thing, or I am going to coagulate this thing. Not necessarily in those terms, but that is what you were doing, right? I am going to do this, I'm going to do that. That is you making the decisions, and as that, fine. But as the part that actually carries it out, no. And so it is not the transformer or the transformed, right? The soul is not the physicality. You reside within the physicality. And so when the physical is transformed, that is not your soul being transformed. It is your soul making the decisions. Whenever I decided I was going to exercise every day, my soul made the decisions. My body is the physicality of carrying it out, but the spirit enables that. The spirit is the part that actually makes the change, the transition, that drives the fuel, that makes everything happen. That is the spirit. The soul makes the decisions. You are the decider, not necessarily the transformer or the transformed. Although your soul can transform, right? Your understanding can get better. You can have better decisions come from that. That is a transformation of the soul. Transformer and transformed. The nature which conquers nature. On the other hand, it is the human soul imprisoned in the body as the anima mundi is in matter. You are not imprisoned. That is victim mentality. That is the intrinsic problem with most of these control systems, that this is some physical punishment. It is not. Just because there were bad times does not make it a bad existence. Normally speaking, there are more good things that happen to you than bad. How is that imprisonment? Now, on top of that, it is my understanding that we are here voluntarily, that you chose to take up residence inside of this temple. God decided that this would be your temple. You were like, yep, bet, go. And you jumped in. You wanted to be here. This is part of the experience, is overcoming this very mindset. This mindset right here is responsible for a great deal of problems that we deal with on a daily basis in society. You are not on a prison planet. You are not being harvested for energy necessarily, right? It does happen, but that is not the point of it, right? Just like you consume food, but your point is not to consume food. It is the same for the energy that you give out, right? There are entities that feed off of that, and some of them are aligned for the detriment of humankind. So you can look at that as an imprisonment if you wish to, but you can remove that energy from them at any point in time. You can make other decisions that is no longer feeding those particular entities, and instead you can feed the entities of positivity, light, and growth. That is a choice that you make. Having this right here, is limiting that choice. It is taking away your ability to take that energy from the negative entities and give it to the right ones, right? Because you believe that you are imprisoned in your body. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of the entirety of human existence. And this soul undergoes the same transformations by death and purification, and finally by glorification, as the lapis. No, your soul doesn't die. Your body does. You are here in temporary residence inside of the carnality, but you are not the carnality. You are not the body, and the part afterwards is already decided. And it was decided before you were created, before you took up inhabitants inside of this vessel. It was already known that you were an infinite individual. You, as a soul, do not die. The body dies. You do not. And so the soul does not undergo a transformation by death or purification. Right? You have a returning to source, which you can look at as a transformation, but it's really just a revealing of what was already there and obscured by your experience. Right? We are here to have experiences. If you realize that from the beginning, it would be a lot less effective. Coming to the understanding as you get into adulthood leads to you making better choices and decisions. It is the tincture which coagulates all substances. Indeed, it even fixes itself. It comes from the center of the earth and is the destroyed earth, nor is there anything on the earth like the tincture. Holy fuck. 633. How very much the tincture is the baptismal water can be seen from the Greek. Being bodies, they become spirits, so that he will baptize in the tincture of the Spirit. There's a similar passage in Pelagios. We are reminded of the famous passage in the Krater and Zosimos, baptized in the Krater, referring to the baptism of Theosebia in the Pomenandres community. Alright, so, from the center of the earth, and is the destroyed earth? No. Right? You come from infinity, from the source, God himself, which may even be outside of the existence, right? You are fully inside of here, but God is not. He may decide from outside of the existence that you need to come here into the existence. That is something that is up for debate. I am not standing firm on that, right? But you came from God, you will return to God. Both of those things to me is intrinsically true to existence. It is even true if you read the Bible in the correct light and take off them glasses of predestination. And so it's not from the center of the earth. Right now, that is an understandable misinterpretation at best, right? There was the land of the dead, which was below the earth, and therefore people thought that maybe that's where we came from. And it may be true. It may be the center of all existence is indeed the center of this earth, but there is no real reason to believe that, and there is no real reason to believe that we came from the center of the earth, or that we are the destroyed earth, because if you didn't know, I mean, this is a big shocker. Are you ready? The earth has not been destroyed. It has been transformed several times, but at no point in time has it been destroyed. At no point in time did it cease to exist. At no point in time was the earth not here for us. Right? Since we have been here, there has been an earth, and there will continue to be one as long as we are here in our understanding. There is no reason to believe that the earth will go away at any point in time. It might be transformed through a series of disasters. I have a whole video and a playlist about that. Right? The 12,000 year disaster cycle to me is a very real thing. That is a cycle of renewal that happens about every 6,000 years in a slightly different way. So there is no destroyed earth. There is no you came from the center of the earth. Both of those things are assumptions that have no foundation whatsoever. Nor is there anything on the earth like the tincture. And that is the tincture as the soul, and there are more than one soul here. The soul is therefore not an earthly, but a transcendental thing. But it came from the earth. Right? According to what you just said, it came from the center of the earth, therefore it would be a earthly thing. Now, I don't believe that. I believe in this transcendentalness. I believe that you can overcome the limitations that are upon you. I've done magic. But, that's more in accordance with me than with this. And this soul, transcendental, would be more along my lines than his as well. Regardless of the fact that the alchemist expected it to appear in a retort. This contradiction presented no difficulties to the medieval mind. There was a good reason for this. The philosophers were so fascinated by their own psychisms that, in their naivete, they faithfully reproduced the inner psychic situation externally. Although the unconscious, personified by the anima, is in itself transcendental, it can appear in the sphere of consciousness, that is, in this world, in the form of an influence on consciousness, on conscious processes. Just as the world soul pervades all things, so does salt. It is ubiquitous and thus fulfills the main requirement of an arcane substance that it can be found everywhere. That is not true. It is mostly true, right? Every living thing does contain salt. That is a truth. All of the things that grow, move, and change contain salt. That is a truth. But it is not necessarily intrinsic to butane, for instance, or even the carbon monoxide that is emitted by the butane. There may not be any hydrogen chloride in there at all, or calcium chloride, or any of the chlorides. Right? There might be, but it is not necessarily intrinsic to. And so it is not that salt is in everything. It can be, it might be, but it is not in some things. There are large deposits of granite that may contain no salt whatsoever. Some of the other rocks, less so, right? Sandstone has a great more deal of salt than granite does. This is not to say that there cannot be salt in everything. This is to say that making the assumption that there is, and thereby making the assumption that it is some mystic arcane substance, that's a stretch. Now, I believe that that is the substance that enables the Holy Spirit to be able to do the things that you wanted to. That the electrical signals that are carried out, right, when you make a decision, there is an electrical signal that your soul makes inside of you, and that creates the electrical signals carried or composed of and carried by the Holy Spirit to make the actions happen, right? I believe that salt is the intrinsic part of that in the body, and that is why it is associated with the body. No doubt the reader will be as conscious as I am of how uncommonly difficult it is to give an account of salt and its ubiquitous connections. Now, I don't have that problem because I am not trying to make it work in the way that he is, right? He is taking all of these references and he is assuming truth, right? That's a big deal. He is assuming truth from these references. Well, if some of those references were from Agrippa, they are automatically dismissed. Paracelsus, pretty close to the same thing, right? I haven't done the study on Paracelsus, but some of the information we got from him is definitely not the correct information, at least as it was relayed by these other writers. And so for me, there is not this difficulty of the salt because I am not trying to push the body into the spirit. I'm not trying to push the body into the soul. I am giving to the body what is due to the body. The physicality, the corporeality, even the conductivity. I am giving all of that to the body. The decisions do not belong to the body. The carrying out of those decisions does not belong to the body. And trying to make that work, which is what we have seen so far in this chapter, right? Trying to make it fit when it doesn't. Right? Just like giving salt the feminine quality, there is no reason for that. There is no reason for that at all. It represents the feminine principle of Eros, just like I just said, which brings everything into relationship in an almost perfect way. In this respect, it is surpassed only by Mercurius, and the notion that salt comes from Mercurius is therefore quite understandable. For salt, as the soul or spark of the anima mundi, both of those are not correct. Those are two different things, right? This is attributing to salt both the soul and the spirit. That does not work at all. For salt, as the soul or spark of the anima mundi, is in very truth the daughter of the spiritus vegetativus of creation. Salt is far more indefinite and far more universal than sulfur, whose essence is fairly well defined by its fiery nature. That is a misunderstanding of sulfur, right? Now, what he is attributing here as the feminine quality belongs to the spirit, right? The spirit has both the masculine and the feminine qualities, both light and dark, positive and negative, creative and destructive. All of that is the spirit. The spirit is every instance of change. Creation would be change, destruction would be change. Adding light would be change, removing light would be change. All of that is represented by the spirit. You don't keep your heart beating. The spirit does that. You don't make yourself breathe unless you're trying, right? You can affect your heart rate too, but if you're trying to change your breath patterns, you can do so consciously through the use of the soul. That is part of the process of manifestation. But generally speaking, you don't. In most cases, you don't pay attention to your breathing unless, like somebody mentions it, and now it's very much in your mind. But when you're asleep, you don't keep yourself breathing. The spirit does that. The spirit is the effect of change, right? It is both in kinetic and potential energy. You are surrounded right now by potential energy. All of the air around you has the potential for change, right? That potential for change can be visualized through different processes. This is one of those processes. The flame is the representative of the logos, the change occurring. This gas is getting transformed into this gas. The process by which it happens is shown by this, but it is not, right, it is not intrinsic to the flame. The flame is the exhibiting of that. The spirit makes that happen. The same thing with lightning. You are surrounded by potential energy right now, and in the right circumstances, that potential energy can change into kinetic, or activated, or however you want to talk about it. And you see the flash of light from lightning. That is the visible manifestation of the change occurring in the atmosphere. That is both the positive and the negative. The potential for change is the feminine quality. The activation of the change is the masculine quality. But both of those qualities are the spirit, not the soul, not the body, the spirit. And that is the sulfur. The sulfur is the spirit, not the soul, not the body. Just like salt is the body, not the soul, not the spirit. It is important, vitally important, to maintain these differences, and his whole problem, it appears, is that he did not understand that. The relationship of salt to the anima mundi, which, as we know, is personified by the primordial man, or anthropos, brings us to the analogy with Christ. Glober himself makes the equation. Sal is soul equals A delta. 634. 634. Okay, we do not have a good 648. Wow, I will forget that. All right, so soul equals A at delta. So that salt becomes an analog of God. That is exactly wrong, right? You are a physical manifestation at the direct will of God, but you are not an analog for God. Most, especially, not your physicality. Salt is the physicality. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of the basic terminology that is involved in this discussion. According to Glober, the sign for salt was originally an octahedron, a double totality symbol. The circle representing non-differentiated wholeness, and the square discriminated wholeness. As a matter of fact, there is another sign for salt. It is a square with the upside-down cross attached, in contradistinction to Venus, which is the circle with the upside-down cross at the bottom, who certainly has less to do with understanding and wisdom than it has salt. Salt has absolutely nothing to do with wisdom or thought. Salt, says Glober, was the first fiat at the creation. Christ is the salt of wisdom, which is given at baptism. We discussed that particular wrong idea yesterday at extended extreme length, and this is going to be a long one, so I'm not going to dive into it today. If you were interested in why Christ is not the salt, pretty much the entire video yesterday was about that. These ideas are elaborated by George von Welling. Christ is the salt, the fiat is the word that is begotten from eternity for our preservation. Christ is the sweet fixed salt of silent, gentle eternity. The body, when salted by Christ, becomes tinctured and therefore incorruptible. And once again, I will point out the very abundant fact that every single Sunday somebody walks down the aisle, says their prayer, receives their redemption, and then goes to work and continues exactly as they did the day before. Right? Therefore, it is not something intrinsic to the process that you become tinctured and therefore incorruptible. As a matter of fact, whenever you make the decision to walk into the light, it is much more likely that you will fall to corruption than before. The Christ parallel runs through, then again, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of salt. Right? Salt is not wisdom. Wisdom is not salt. The Christ parallel runs through the late alchemical speculations that set in after Bohm, and it was made possible by the Sal-Sapientia equation. Already in antiquity, salt denoted wit, good sense, good taste, etc., as well as spirit. Cicero, for instance, remarks, in wit, sale, and humor Caesar surpassed them all. In wit and humor. But it was the Vulgate that has the most decisive influence on the formation of alchemical concepts. That is telling you an awful fucking lot right there. In the Old Testament, even the salt of the covenant has a moral meaning. In the New Testament, the famous words, "Ye are the salt of the earth." There is an allegory there for sure, but that is one that is missed. Matthew 5:13 show that the disciples were regarded as personifications of higher insight and divine wisdom, or that they were corporeal bodies meant to live in the corporeal life. Just as in their role of proclaimers of the message, they functioned as angels, messengers. Whoa. So that God's kingdom on earth might approximate as closely as possible to the structure of the heavenly hierarchy. And that's exactly what happened. That is evidenced by the fruit of their labors, that we are now, on earth, structured most closely to God's kingdom on earth. We are currently arranged in such a way that we are a physical representation of heaven displayed upon the earth. I hope you detect the irony there. The other well-known passages at Mark 9:50, ending with the words, "Have salt in yourselves, and have peace with one another." The earliest reference to salt in the New Testament, Colossians 4:6, likewise has a classical flavor. It is well worth noting. Right? This is from Mark, which is one of the Gospels. This is from Colossians, which came from somebody who was never studying at the feet of Christ. But this is the earliest reference to salt, which predates Mark significantly. That is important to note. If you were unfamiliar with any of that, I suggest you check out the New Testament. There are reasons why I point that out. The earliest reference to salt in the New Testament likewise has a classical flavor. "Let your speech be always with grace, and seasoned with salt, that ye may know how ye ought to answer every man." Here, salt undoubtedly means insight, understanding, wisdom. In both Matthew and Mark, the salt is liable to lose its savor. Evidently, this salt must keep its tang, just as the wise virgins kept their lamps trimmed. For this purpose, a flexibility of mind is needed, and the last thing to guarantee this is rigid insistence on the necessity of faith. Everyone will admit that it is the task of the church to safeguard her store of wisdom, the Octa Doctrine, in its original purity. No, everyone will not admit that. I will not admit that it is the task of the church to safeguard her store of wisdom. I am of the opinion that the church, and it is referring to the Catholic Church here, does not have that wisdom, possibly never possessed that wisdom, does not have the fruit of that wisdom. Those trees are entirely dead, withered, and desiccated. In its original purity, and yet in response to the changing spirit of the times, she must go on altering it and differentiating it just as the fathers did. If it was wisdom, it would not need altering. For the cultured Greco-Roman world, early Christianity was, among other things, a message in philosophical disguise, as we can quite plainly see from Hippolytus. It was a competing philosophical doctrine that reached a certain peak of perfection in St. Thomas. Until well into the 16th century, the degree of philosophical truth of Christian doctrine corresponded to that of scientific truth today. The physicians and natural philosophers of the Middle Ages nevertheless found themselves faced with problems for which the church had no answer, like gravity and globes, eternal life, baptisms and blood, all kinds of problems that the church really did not have the answer for. Confronted with sickness and death, the physicians did not hesitate to seek counsel with the Arabs, and so resuscitate that bit of the ancient world which the church thought she had exterminated forever. namely the Mandean and Sabaean remnants of Hellenistic syncretism. From them they derived a sal sapente that seems so unlike the doctrine of the Church that before long a process of mutual assimilation arose which put forth some very remarkable blossoms. The ecclesiastical allegories kept, so far as I can judge, to the classical usage of sal. Only St. Hilary seems to have gone rather more deeply into the nature of salt when he remarks that salt contains in itself the element of water and fire, and by this is one out of the two. Pencinellus observes, two elements which stir up an implacable enmity between themselves are found in the wondrous alliance in salt, for salt is wholly fire and wholly water. For the rest, he advises a sparing use of salt. Let the word be sprinkled with salt, not deluged with it. And another, earlier allegorist, the Jesuit Nicholas Cousin, does not mention salt at all. This is not altogether surprising, for how do wisdom and revelation square with one another? As certain books of the Old Testament canon show, there is, besides the wisdom of God, which expresses itself in revelation, a human wisdom which cannot be had unless one works for it. Mark 9:50 therefore exhorts us to make sure that we always have enough salt in us, and he is certainly not referring to divine revelation, for this is something no man can produce in his own resources. But at least he can cultivate and increase his own human wisdom. Now, all of these references for me are not going to be correct, right? I'm not going to keep pausing to point that out, but I am going to do it right here one last time. All of these biblical references is a complete misunderstanding of salt in the alchemical sense. That does not mean that they did not have their own allegories for it, but in the sense of the Trinity that is, not the one that is created, but the one that it is the representative of body, which is the corporeality. It is not the soul, it is not the spirit. That Mark should offer this warning, and that Paul should express himself in very similar way, is in accord with the traditional Judo-Hellenism of the Jewish communities at that time. An authoritarian church, however, leaves very little room for the salt of human wisdom. Hence, it is not surprising that the sal sapente plays an incomparably greater role outside the church. Irenaeus, reporting the views of the Gnostics, says, "The spiritual, they say, is sent forth to this end, that, being united here below with the psychic, it may take form and be instructed simultaneously by intercourse with it. And this they declare to be the salt and the light of the world." And again, that is salt in the wrong attribution, but the spiritual is sent forth to this end, that being united here below with the psychic, it may take form. I agree with that. The union of the spiritual masculine principle with the feminine psychic principle is far from being just a fantasy of the Gnostics. It has found an echo in the Assumption of the Virgin, a union of Tifereth and Malkuth, and in Goethes, the eternal feminine leads us upwards and on. Hippolytus mentions the same view as that of the Sethians. He says, "But when this wave is raised from the water by the wind, and made pregnant in its nature, and has received within itself the reproductive power of the feminine, it retains the light scattered from on high, together with the fragrance of the spirit. And that is nous given shape in various forms. This light is a perfect God, who is brought down from the unbegotten light on high, and from the spirit into man's nature, as into a temple, by the power of nature and the movement of the wind. It is engendered from the water and commingled and mixed with the bodies as if it were the salt of all created things, and a light of the darkness struggling to be freed from the bodies, and not able to find a way out. For some very small spark of the light is mingled with the fragrance from above." Alright, so this is not bad, right? When the wave is raised from the water by the wind, and is pregnant in its nature. Water is not the representative of the spirit, but it is understandable why it is. We talked about that before, but it is true, right? One of the exercises that I give in this book is to identify yourself as sitting in water, and that is for a reason. When you move the spirit internally, it feels like water moving. When you move it externally, you can feel those reverberations through the air if you are sensitive to these things, and that is what I do, right? In that understanding, right, as the representative of spirit, as the water that you can move, when this wave is raised from the water by the wind being air, being the part that makes the decisions, being the representative of the soul, the will, the direction, the choice, the making, right? That is what the soul does. It makes the choice, sets the direction. And so when the soul, the wind, decides to raise the water, the wave from the water, and made pregnant by its nature, receive the feminine reproductive power of the feminine, it retains the light scattered from on high. In my understanding, we have the below, which is the receptive feminine part, and the above, which is the masculine penetrative part. The masculine part is the light, scattered from on high and held together with the fragrance of the spirit. Quite literally. It is penetrating into the spirit, and it is the spirit itself. It is that agent of change that we talked about. And so, for me, this is a good reference, even though it is not quoted correctly, right? He is saying that this is the reference to salt, right? And that the nous, the will to shape, given shape in various forms. This light is a perfect God. Now, that is the balance. It is brought down from the unbegotten into man's nature, which is taking it from the point above into the point below and melding the two together, which creates the perfect light. By the power of nature and the movement of the wind. And again, the wind is your decision to make it happen. It is your will that is the wind, the part that makes the decisions. Air. It is engendered from the water and commingled and mixed with the bodies, as if it were salt. Not that it is salt, but as if it were salt, it is mixed into the salt. Right? A light of the darkness struggling to be freed from the bodies and not able to find a way out. That is without conscious intention. I can move the light outside of myself. Some very small spark of the light is mingled, again, as above, so below, and the fragrance from above. Back to the text. Here follows a corrupt and controversial passage which I pass over. Whoa, I want that. What is that? Because that's probably going to be more in accordance with what I think than what he's putting forward. Therefore, every thought and care of the light from above is how and in what way the nous, the will to create, may be delivered from the death of the sinful and dark body from the Father below. That again is equating Lucifer, the devil, with God, and that is stupid. Footnote 648. Death and the Father below are both preceded by the same from, and are therefore parallel if not identical. Insofar as the begetter of life is also the begetter of death, this is an indication of the ineluctable polaristic nature of the octaratum. Now, that is okay, right? That is attributing not to the separate entity, but to the same entity. Now, whether that is above or below, you can make your arguments. That is a relative term. Above and below is relative to your positionality. Right? Anything above your head is above, but if you move up, some things that were above will be now below. It is relative. From the Father below, who is the wind, which raised up the waves in tumult and terror, and begot nous, his own perfect Son, who is not yet not his own Son in substance. For he was a ray of light from on high, from that perfect light, overpowered in the dark and terrible, bitter, polluted water, and a shining spirit carried away over the water. 649 is from Melensios. We will not be back here till 658. This strangely beautiful passage contains pretty well everything that the alchemist endeavored to say about salt. It is the spirit. No. The turning of the body into light. No. The spark of the anima mundi. No. Imprisoned in the dark depths of the sea and begotten there by the light from above and the reproductive power of the feminine is only partially correct. Right? These first things are absolutely not. Right? Salt is not the spirit. They were two different things. Hopefully I've hit that hard enough. The turning of the body into the light? No. It is not. That is again the spirit. The spark of the anima mundi? Again the spirit. Imprisoned in the dark depths of the sea, and they're begotten there by the light from above and the reproductive power of the feminine. That is true, but that is not taking into account that the dark is the part two. Right? That is the spirit, not the salt. Right? So that is entirely incorrect. This entire paragraph is about the spirit, not about the salt. But this last part is only taken in half of the spirit. It should be noted that the alchemist could have known nothing of Hippolytus, as his Philosophia, long believed lost, was rediscovered only in the middle of the 19th century in a monastery on Mount Athos. Anyone familiar with the spirit of alchemy and the view of the Gnostics in Hippolytus will be struck again and again by their inner affinity. The clue to this passage from the Elenchos, and to other similar ones, is to be found in the phenomenology of the self. Salt is not a very common dream symbol, but it does appear in the cubic form of a crystal, which, in many patients' drawings, represent the center and hence the self. The cube is the 8 principle. It is 4 into time, 8, the perfection of creation. Salt is a cube, so is gold, so is diamonds, right? The natural, intrinsic form of these perfect minerals is a cube. If you are unfamiliar with that, I have a video called The Fundamental Harmonics of Life, where we explore that concept quite extensively. There are 8 classifications of stone, there are 8 different parts of the earth, there are 8 different parts of the atmosphere, there are 8 different notes in the harmonic. 8 is an important number. The cube is the representative of 8. It is the 4 into motion of creation. It is very important. Similarly, the quaternary structure of most mandalas remind one of the sign for salt mentioned earlier. Just as the numerous synonyms and attributes of the lapis stress now one and now another of its aspects, so do the symbols of the self. Apart from its preservative quality, salt has mainly the metaphorical meaning of sapientia. With regard to this aspect, the Tractus Aureus states, now, sapientia is the ability to cognate, the ability to think. That is not salt. That is the body. That is not the soul. The soul is the part that thinks. With regard to this aspect, the Tractus Aureus states, it is said in the mystic language of our sages, he who works without salt will never raise dead bodies. He who works without salt draws a bow without a string, for you must know that these sayings refer to a very different kind of salts from the common mineral. Sometimes they call the medicine itself salt. These words are ambiguous. Here salt means wit, as well as wisdom. That is not a bad attribution, right? Now, it is for salt, right? Salt is the body. It is not the part that thinks. That is the soul, Mercury, Mercury. The quicksilver, the part that moves, air. Or the part that makes decisions, not the part that moves, right? But here, salt means wit as well as wisdom. Wisdom is applied knowledge, right? Intelligence is the ability to gather the knowledge. Wisdom is the ability to apply the knowledge. Wit is a function of wisdom, right? You use your wisdom to formulate your wit. Wit is more associated with making humorous statements, but you use your wisdom, your understanding of intelligence, in order to do that. And so these words, wit and wisdom, are somewhat ambiguous. But it is not salt. As to the importance of salt in the opus, Johannes Gracius says of the arcane substance, and this is the lead of the philosophers, which is also called the lead of the air. In it is found the shining white dove, named the salt of the metals, wherein is the whole majesty of the work. The dove is the pure, chaste, wise, and rich Queen of Sheba. Alright, so lead and salt are interchangeable. Both of those is the body. Both of those are the primary element which is transformed by the Spirit into creation. Both of those, right? And so lead and salt both represent the body equally. And so this is a reference to that, right? Even the lead of the air, right? That would be the body of the soul. And so, yeah. Right now, this dove is the pure, chaste, wise, and rich Queen of Sheba. That is probably going to be the Spirit. Again, we talked quite extensively about the two doves, the feathered dove and the unfeathered dove, the light dove and the dark dove, being the representative of the as above and the as below. Here, salt, arcane substance, the paradoxical lead of the air. The white dove, spiritus sapiente, wisdom, and femininity appear in one figure. Now that is the dove in the other context, right? We have these two contexts which do not accord with each other. I don't care that it is the same symbol, right? One dove represents the spirit. This dove is representing the soul. Those are two different things, even if they are using the same context, right? The same picture. That doesn't mean anything other than that they misunderstood the picture. The saying from the Gloria Mundi is quite clear. No man can understand this art, if he does not know the salt and its preparation. For the aquarium sapientium, the salt sapenti, comes from the aqua benedicta, or aqua pontica, which, itself an extract, is named heart, soul, and spirit. Again, that is the trinity of heart would be the body, soul would be the part that makes the decisions, spirit is the part that carries it out. Right? This trying to put together into one place these different contexts without understanding those contexts is a source of confusion. At first, the aqua is contained in the primal materia and is of a blood red color, but after its preparation becomes of a bright, clear, transparent white, and is called by the sages the salt of wisdom. Coonrath boldly summarizes these statements about the salt when he says, all water cannot be made without the salt of wisdom, for it is the true salt of wisdom itself, say the philosophers, a fire and a salt fire, the true, living, universal menstruum. Without salt, the work has no success. Elsewhere, he remarks, not without good reason has salt been adorned by the wise with the name of wisdom. We're going to talk about one of the qualities of salt real quick, because salt is an underlying fundamental element, right? And by that I mean, and we are going to use one of the most basic examples. If you make bread, I make bread quite often. It is one of the things that I enjoy. I make yeast bread, I make non-yeast bread. I enjoy making bread. Bread is composed of, at most, 4 things, right? There is flour, there is water, there is yeast, and there is salt. If you do not have all 4 of these components, you do not get yeast bread. If you miss the salt, the bread will not have structure. It will collapse. It will not be able to rise correctly. That is a true thing. It's not just that it doesn't taste right, and it won't. But if you forget to add the salt, there will not be a rise structure. Now, it may rise, but it's going to be lumpy. It's going to be ugly. It's not going to do what it was meant to do. It is intrinsic to bread that salt is included. And that is also for non-yeast bread, right? If you do not add the salt, it will become gooey. It wouldn't even like pita bread. Pita bread doesn't rise, right? Not really, but it bakes. It gets air pockets in it, but it doesn't expand in the way that the carbon dioxide from the yeast makes it happen. But even then, if you forget to put in salt, your pita will come out more like a tortilla, and it will be gooey, right? That is how it works. If you forget to put in salt, the structure does not take place. That is true for most chemical components. Right? Not all of them. There are things that are elementally pure that does not contain any of the chlorides, but for most things in physicality, it needs that, right? Even like tea. A little bit of salt in your tea actually makes it a little bit better. Not a lot, just a little bit. The same is true with beer. The same is true with whatever you're cooking, right? Salt is a fundamental part of the experience. That is even true for physicality. Like this sheetrock contains salt in it to help with the structure. That is a true thing. And so when it says without salt the work has no success here, that is physical alchemy, right? That is true with mental alchemy too, without the knowledge of the body and how to incorporate. But in physicality, doing physical alchemy, if there is not salt, there is a good chance that it is going to fail. I want to point that out because this repeated pattern where the alchemists are talking about salt, that is a fundamental misunderstanding of that trinity. Right? That is quite apparent. That is quite a source of confusion in this particular study. But it is true. Without salt, there is no success. Right? But salt is not the lapis. A mystery to be hidden. Footnote. Well, we're not there yet. One more. Vingenaris says that the Redeemer chose his disciples that they might be the salt of men and proclaim to them the pure and incorruptible doctrine of the gospel. That's exactly what happened. We got the pure and incorruptible doctrine of the gospel that is evident by the fact that everybody is perfectly aligned right now. He reports the Kabbalist as saying that the computatio 658, by computatio is meant the isosophia, that is, the sum which results from the numerical values of the letters in a word. This word then being equated with another word having the same numerical value, that is gematria, that is useless. Right? I say so very often that if you are doing complicated mathematics and spiritual enlightenment, you are doing it wrong. There is numbers. Numbers are an important, vital part of the understanding process. But if you are doing complicated mathematics to arrive at the numbers, not even just simple arithmetic, but adding together this convoluted series of things to try to derive wisdom from it. One of the best ways that I have to point out that gematria is useless is that you can find pretty much anything you want simply by desiring to do so. This is 2025. Donald Trump is the current president. Somebody out there is fully convinced that he is the Antichrist. You can find evidence for that through gematria. If you go through and you look up Donald John Trump, it may end up being 666. Of course, that's the number of the beast. Obviously, he is the Antichrist. But if that doesn't work, you can say it's Donald J. Trump, and then that might add up to 666, and then, of course, he is obviously the Antichrist. But if that doesn't work, it can be DJ Trump, and then that might be 666, so that is obviously, you see what I'm saying? You can make it fit. You can adjust your criteria in any way that you want to arrive at the conclusion that you have already derived. That is one of the major problems with gematria. That is from every study that I have done, right? And I have done a study of gematria, not an extensive one through Kabbalah, but by people that practice it on the internet. There has been no instance, not a single one, where what they have predicted through gematria has come true. Not a single instance at all that I have found where a single time somebody said, oh, the Bible says that this thing is going to happen due to gematria, and then it happens. Has not happened a single time in my experience, and it is somewhat of an extensive experience. He reports the Kabbalist as saying that the computiato of the Hebrew word for salt, milach, gives the number 78. This number could be divided by any divisor and still give a word that referred to the divine name. See them complicated mathematics? We will not pursue the inferences, but draws from this. We will not pursue the inferences he draws from this, but will only note that for all those reasons, salt was used for the service of God in all offerings and sacrifices. That was probably due to the fact that the priests were going to eat that. That was how the priests didn't have to actually raise their own crops and animals. It was because of the sacrifice they would get this food from the flames, and that's what they would eat. And of course, they would salt it because then it would taste better. And we just talked about salt being necessary for the chemical process of cooking. Yeah. 659. 659 is just a reference to Theatrica Chemicum. Glober calls Christ the Sal Sepente and says that his favorite disciple, John, was salted with the salt of wisdom. That is 660. Christ as Sal Sepente is another symbol of the self. Apart from its lunar wetness and its terrestrial nature, the most outstanding properties of salt are bitterness and wisdom. As in the double quaternion of the elements and qualities, earth and water have coldness in common. So bitterness and wisdom would form a pair of opposites with a third thing between. See the diagram on the facing page. We will get to that in a minute. The factor, common to both, however incommensurable to the two ideas may seem, is psychologically the function of feeling. Tears, sorrow, and disappointment are bitter, but wisdom is the comforter in all psychic suffering. I don't know that I agree with that. Indeed, bitterness and wisdom, that is feeling, right? Bitterness, yeah, that is a feeling, that is for sure, and wisdom is what you get from discovering the root cause of those feelings, right? We talk about shadow work all the time. Whenever you are feeling bitter, that is letting you know that you need to investigate something about yourself. Whenever you're feeling angry, there is something you need to investigate about yourself. Sorrow, joy, all of these things, they are keys to let you know there are things happening to you in life and you need to understand them. That understanding is wisdom. The feeling of those feelings is what is being referred to as bitterness, right? Earth and water have coldness in common. That is the designation that is given, but that does not mean anything, really. So bitterness and wisdom would form a pair of opposites. That I'm going to hardly disagree with, right? Your feelings are not dependent upon your wisdom in discerning what those feelings mean. And so that is not a natural opposite, right? And we'll use lust and chastity for a natural opposite, right? Lust is the overconsumption of the pleasures of the flesh. Chastity is the non-consumption of the pleasures of the flesh. That is a pair of opposites. One is the unrestricted throwing around of genitalia to whoever might accept it, and the other one is not at all throwing those genitalia around in any circumstance whatsoever. That is opposites, right? Greed and charity are opposites. The love of the mortal coil to the exception of the spiritual, that's greed. The love of the spiritual to the exception of the mortal coil, that's charity. Neither one are intrinsically good. There's a balance between those that should be stricken, and that is generosity. You should be generous. You should not be greedy or necessarily charitable. Charitable is giving away things past the point where it is useful. And so that is a natural pair of opposites. Bitterness and wisdom are not, right? From bitterness, you can achieve wisdom. You can do the root source. You can go back and investigate. But ignorance would be the opposite of wisdom, right? Intelligence is taking on of the information. Wisdom is the ability to use that intelligence. The opposite of that is not having the ideas, is not having the capacity for understanding. That would be the opposite of wisdom. Not bitterness. Bitterness is a circumstance that alerts you to the need to understand. And so it would even be a function of wisdom to feel bitterness. Therefore, it cannot be the opposite of it. The factor common to both, however incommensurable may seem, is the function of feeling. Right? Now, feeling is a thing, right? Feeling, again, is that trigger that lets you know that you need wisdom. Tears, sorrow, and disappointment are bitter, but wisdom is the comforter. Indeed, bitterness and wisdom form a pair of alternatives. Where there is bitterness, wisdom is lacking. And where there is wisdom, there can be no bitterness. And again, that is a function of, right? Just like jealousy is a function of greed, right? Jealousy is not in and of itself a vice. That is a function of greed, and greed is the vice. What is another good one? Right, there's a lot of them, but they're very topical. When they come up, it's easy to be like, oh yeah, this is a function of that. Not necessarily, right, lying. Lying is not a vice. Lying is a function of pride. You lie because you think it will make you look bad. That is a function of pride. I mean, that is a fundamental understanding that needs to happen. All of the virtues and vices as I have described them are the key components, in my understanding, as opposed to the function of. And that is a major, major distinction. Salt, as the carrier of this fateful alternative, is coordinated with the nature of woman. The masculine solar nature in the right half of the quartinio knows neither coldness nor a shadow, nor heaviness, melancholy, etc., because, so long as all goes well, it identifies as closely as possible with consciousness, and that as a rule is the idea which one has of oneself. In this idea, the shadow is usually missing, first because nobody likes to admit to any inferiority, and second because logic forbids something white to be called black. A good man has good qualities, and only the bad man has bad qualities. For reasons of prestige, we pass over the shadow in complete silence. A famous example of masculine prejudice is Nietzsche's Superman, who scorns compassion and fights against the ugliest man, the ordinary man that everyone is. That is not a horrible understanding of Nietzsche's Superman. We have done a study of it. We did Nietzsche, Thus Spake Zarathustra. Nietzsche had problems. He had some definite not understandings, but he did have some understandings. And his understanding of the Superman was not what the Nazis took it to be, where there is this guiding of humanity through the artificial means of governmental structures, through eugenics, right? But instead, it was that you, as the individual, should strive to be, as the individual, the best example of individual that you could possibly be, right? That is not saying that you are setting yourself against humanity, but with the understanding that most of humanity does not strive to be the best that they can be. That is a hard truth for a lot of people, right? Especially if you are on this path, to come to the understanding that, quite honestly, you are probably not giving your best effort is a hard truth to take, but it is a truth. Nobody can be completely diligent all of the time, and we have a tendency to overlook our slothfulness. The Nietzsche Superman was that every man should strive to be better than every other man. Not necessarily in a prideful way, but you should be in the best physical shape that you possibly can be. You should strive to increase your intelligence and your wisdom, both the things that you absorb from the world and your understanding of them. That is the Superman. And to live out the example of that, to be that example. Nietzsche's tendency towards despondency, which was definitely a thing. He had severe depressive tendencies that he did not address in the correct way at all through his entire life. Right? That tendency of his to be depressive was because he was trying to be the Superman, but nobody else was. And that was what caused him most of his problems in his life. And I fully understand that, right? I am on a path where I am attempting to be the best me that I can be. I fail at that quite often, right? I do not try to claim to be perfect, but perfect is my goal. It is where I strive for, and that does not mean that it is in accordance with the Bible, right? That means that sometimes there is a use for rightful anger. There is a time for jealousy and greed. There is a time to use the vices as well as the virtues, and that balance makes me different. It sets me apart. It would be so much easier for me if I could just comport with Christianity, right? I could be rich if I would just lie. If I would just say, yeah, it's perfectly fine to put off on someone else your redemption. That would be an easy thing to lie about. I could do it, except I can't. Not and be who I want to be. And so it is easily to understand why Nietzsche had such a problem, especially in the day which he lived. Right? There was still a very firm grip by the churches. And so he was attempting to overthrow those control systems, and he got very upset that nobody else wanted to. That is what we got from the Thus Spake Zarathustra. You are more than welcome to check out the entire study. There is some good stuff to get from there. And I believe that his problem at the very end, when he lost his ability to move, right, was because he tried to unlock a door without the understanding that was necessary to unlock that door. Back to the text. The shadow must not be seen. It must be denied, repressed, twisted into something quite extraordinary. What? I disagree with that wholeheartedly, emphatically, right? Your shadow must be seen. It must not be denied, repressed, or twisted, but instead turned into something quite extraordinary. I mean, once you have the ability to identify your shadow side, you have the ability to strengthen that, right? I have tendencies, right? I am an SI demon, right? I have a very bad time with organization, memories, sexual desires, addiction tendencies. All of those things are intrinsically bad for me. I have overcome most of them, right? My addictive problems are pretty much non-existent. I still have some issues, right? I still smoke my weed. I enjoy it. But it's not to the point where it is detrimental in my life at all. And I don't use it in a manner which is detrimental in my life. And so that is me absorbing the shadow in a positive manner, right? Some people are addicted. They have no capacity to not function in the way that is part of that process, right? People identify themselves as weed people all the time. That is an addiction, right? If you are identifying yourself as a wake and bake, you probably have some problems with coping with society. That is you denying your shadow side. That is you not identifying these problems. It is the same for all addictive tendencies. Your shadow aspect, the demon function for you, the very bottom of your stack, you have to identify that. You have to investigate your roots, your triggers, your causalities, or else you will not have any progress. And the only way to do that is by investigating your shadow. It has to be seen, not denied, but instead incorporated. Not repressed, but instead utilized. And definitely not twisted, but instead purified. Turned into something that is useful for you. Right? My inability to organize leads me to greater organization. It leads me to enacting systems by which I am more organized. That is shadow work, right? Figuring out where you lack and what you can do to boost that is shadow work, because the full incorporation of yourself is taking those demon tendencies and turning them around. And so I completely disagree with this statement whatsoever. Right? Now, it should not be reveled in. You should not take it as an identity for yourself. Your shadow is a function. It is part of who you are, but it is not who you are. You are the ability to overcome that. That is part of your challenge being here. This is not a prison, but it is an experience. And part of the experience is learning how to incorporate your shadow. Back to the text. The sun is always shining and everything smiles back. There is no room for any prestige diminishing weakness, so the soul nigere is never seen. Only in solitary hours is its presence feared. This is the chart that was referred to earlier. This is a thing, but it is quite arbitrary, right? It is understandable why the sun is warm and why the moon is cold. We discussed that at great length, right? But the dry and moist, kind of whatever, like fire, earth, like these designations are not necessarily intrinsic. They are fairly correlative, not necessarily intrinsic. Things are different with Luna. Every month she is darkened and extinguished. She cannot hide this from anybody, not even from herself. She knows that this same Luna is now bright and now dark, but who has ever heard of a dark sun? We call this quality of Luna woman's closeness to nature, and the fiery brilliance and hot air that plays around the surface things we like to call the masculine mind, because of course the patristic society would call fiery brilliance masculine. Despite all attempts at denial and obfuscation, there is an unconscious factor, a black sun, which is responsible for the surprisingly common phenomenon of masculine split-mindedness. When the right hand mustn't know what the left is doing. This split in the masculine psyche and the regular darkening of the moon in woman together explain the remarkable fact that woman is accused of all the darkness in man. That doesn't explain it. What explains it is that men have been in control and they are attributing to women the negative qualities. That is a thing, right? Once again, there is no reason to attribute some of these attributes to feminine, other than the fact that men were in charge. While he himself basks in the thought that he is a veritable fount of vitality and illumination for all the females in his environment. Actually, he would be better advised to shroud the brilliance of his mind in the profoundest doubt. It is not difficult for this type of mind, which, besides other things, is a great trickster, like Mercurius, to admit a host of sins in the most convincing way, and even to combine it with a spurious feeling of ethical superiority without in the least approximating a genuine insight. This can never be achieved without the participation of feeling, but the intellect admits feeling only when it is convenient. The novolunium of woman is a source of countless disappointments for man, which easily turns to bitterness, though they could equally well be a source of wisdom if they were understood. Naturally, this is possible only if he is prepared to acknowledge his black sun, that is, his shadow. And shadow work is vitally important. Confirmation of our interpretation of salt as eros, an example as a feeling relationship, is found in the fact that the bitterness is the origin of the colors. What? No, it is not. We have only to look at drawings and paintings of patients who supplement their analysis by active imagination to see that colors are feeling values. That is not the same thing. That is not the same thing. Just because you can use colors in a way that attributes to the colors a particular thing, right? We have said that anger is red. There are very valid reasons for that. It is the very bottom down here. Both love and wrath are signified by anger, right? Love is signified by red all of the time. We do that all of the time. But you see red, right? That is wrath. There's a reason for that correlation, right? But that is the indicator of, not the source of, right? So if you are feeling angry, you are colored by red. But that doesn't mean that red causes your anger. That means that you exhibit the red because of your anger. Now, many of these people who have psychological problems have a tendency to be able to see these things, right? And they see the auras. They see the chakras. They see the alignment. That causes them great distress in our world of rationality, and therefore they wind up in these institutions. That is not all of them, but many of them. And so it is quite natural that they would attribute to these particular emotions these particular colors. Now, this is love and wrath, right? This is sexual desire. This is jealousy, or cowardice is yellow. Green is envy. It is a function of greed, right? Greed is green. Charity is green as well, right? Each of these colors represent, as well as the fundamental understanding of the virtues and vices, the effects that are felt from them, right? Anger is a function of wrath. It is signified by the color red, but that does not mean that red causes anger. This is saying that it does, That is not a confirmation of your interpretation of salt as eros. Back to the text. Mostly, to begin with, only a pencil or pen is used to make rapid sketches of dreams, sudden ideas, and fantasies. But from a certain movement on the patient's, from a certain moment on, the patients begin to make use of color, and this is generally the moment when merely intellectual interest gives way to emotional participation. Occasionally, the same phenomenon can be observed in dreams, which, at such moments, are dreamt in color, or a particularly vivid color is insisted upon. Disappointment, always a shock to the feelings, is not only the mother of bitterness, but the strongest incentive to a differentiation of feeling. The failure of a pet plan, the disappointing behavior of someone one loves, can supply the impulse either for a more or less brutal outburst of affect or for a modification and adjustment of feeling, and hence for its higher development. This culminates in wisdom if feeling is supplemented by reflection and rational insight. Wisdom is never violent. Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling. This is not entirely correct. There is wisdom in defending someone who is being assaulted, right? If you are doing so in a manner which is effective, right? There's a lot less wisdom if you are running in as a 5'2" dude against a 6'4" dude. There's not a lot of wisdom in that, right? You are going to wind up hurt. Now, you may distract them from the other person, and that can be considered wisdom, but a lot less so, right? But there is wisdom sometimes in violence. Not all of the time. Not even most of the time. Not even almost all the time, right? But every once in a while, there is wisdom in violence. Now, that violence should be carried out in the manner in which it is most effective. But the defense of someone else is a wise use of wrath, right? Righteous anger is a very valid thing that you should take part in. And so wisdom is sometimes violent, right? That is not violent without reason, but it is violent, and therefore this is not correct. The interpretation of salt and its qualities prompts us to ask, in all cases where alchemical statements are involved, whether the alchemists themselves had such thoughts. We know from the literature that they were thoroughly aware of the moral meaning of the amoretudo, and by sapientia they did not mean anything essentially different from what we understand by this word. But how the wisdom comes from the bitterness, and how the bitterness can be the source of colors, on this point they leave us in the dark. Yeah, I bet they do. Nor do we have any reason to believe that these connections were so self-evident to them that they regarded any explanation as superfluous. Now for me, that is this, right? That is the reasons why. If that were so, someone would have been sure to blurt it out. That is an assumption that is not necessarily true, right? There is very few accounts of, like, we have some very detailed receipts from antiquity, right? We have storehouse inventories, we have bills of lading, we have transfers of funds and supplies. All of those are recorded. But we don't have, for instance, a recording in Sumerian of how to cut down a tree. We don't have a recording in Sumerian of how to start a fire. We don't have a recording in Assyrian on these things. They were so commonplace, so much an intrinsic part of the existence, that it was not considered necessary to write these things down. That is the opposite of this assumption, right? If it were so, someone would have been sure to blurt it out. Maybe. But then again, we do have control systems which have taken knowledge from us. Underneath the Vatican is contained a vast storehouse of knowledge which almost nobody ever gets to see or even know the contents thereof. Many of our documents from antiquity, some of which may have explained this, could very well be locked up because they explain this. It is much more probable that they simply said these things without any conscious act of cognition. Moreover, the sum of all these statements is seldom or never found consistently formulated in any one author. Rather, one author mentions one thing and another, and it is only by viewing them all together, as we have tried to do here, that we get the whole picture. Now, we have seen him trying to do that has caused the problem, right? There was bad knowledge, right? Cornelius Agrippa is going to be my go-to for that, because he is the source that so many people use. But all he did was collect things. He did a Solomon, right? He wasn't wise. He just collected the sayings of the wise. That's where we got the Proverbs. That's what a Cornelius did, but he did not even discern whether they were wise. He just wrote it down because somebody else had said it. There are many of those sources. We have seen several of them here today in this study, in this particular salt section for damn sure. There is good sources and there are bad sources. Jung did not differentiate between them. He tried to reconcile the bad with the good. And that's where his major problem and contention is here. Footnote 661. Olympiodorus remarks, thus the key to the meaning of the circular art is a synopsis thereof. And the Turba says, the more I read the books, the more I am enlightened. The alchemists themselves suggest this method, and I must admit that it was their advice which first put me on the track of psychological interpretation. The Rosarium says one should read from page to page, and other sayings are, he should possess many books, and one book opens another. We talk quite often about keys. Sorry, I got the hiccups. We talk quite often about keys, right? And the best way to get keys is through the books. We have gotten many keys through these books already, right? These studies, they have purpose. Even the ones that are terrible. See Cornelius Agrippa. See Aleister Crowley. See Eliphas Levi. Those were absolutely terrible studies. But they allow us to dismiss things. They allow us to understand where these misunderstandings came from. And so even having those valueless books have value, right? Simply as a way to dismiss things. You should possess many books. Now, I don't have the physical ability to buy, right? I am not physically blessed with abundance in that manner, at least not yet. And so I have to do it on the internet. But I am reading from these books from page to page. I am possessing them. I am taking them into myself, incorporating them, and extracting the wisdom out of the intelligence that they give me. One book opens another is absolutely true. Sometimes we find keys that open other things. See Dante's Inferno. Back to the text. Yet the complete lack, until the 19th century, of any psychological viewpoint, which even today meets with the grossest misunderstandings, makes it very unlikely that anything resembling a psychological interpretation penetrated into the consciousness of the alchemists. Their moral concepts moved entirely on the plane of synonym and analogy, in a word, of correspondence. Most of their statements spring not from a conscious but from an unconscious act of thinking, as do dreams, sudden ideas, and fantasies, where again we can only find out the meaning afterwards by careful comparison and analysis. But the greatest of all riddles, of course, is the ever-recurring question of what the alchemists really meant by their substances. What, for instance, is the meaning of a sal spirituale? The only possible answer seems to be this. Chemical matter was so completely unknown to them that it instantly became a carrier for projections. Its darkness was so loaded with unconscious contents that a state of participation mystique. 662. I take the concept of participation mystique in the sense defined above from the works of Levi Brou. Recently, this idea has been repudiated by ethnologists, partly for the reason that primitives know very well how to differentiate between things. There is no doubt about that, but it cannot be denied either that incommensurable things can have, for them, an equally incommensurable tertium comparatonius. One has only to think of the ubiquitous term of mana, the werewolf motif, etc. Furthermore, unconscious identity is a psychic phenomenon, which the psychotherapist has to deal with every day. Certain ethnologists have also rejected Levi Bruhl's concept of the hot presteluk, which is closely connected with that of participation. The term is not a very happy one, for in his own way, the primitive thinks just as logically as we do. Levi Bruhl was aware of this, as I knew from personal conversation with him. By pre-logical, he meant the primitive suppositions that contradict only our rationalistic logic. These presuppositions are often exceedingly strange, and though they may not deserve to be called pre-logical, they certainly merit the term irrational. Astonishingly enough, Levi Bruhl, in his posthumously published diary, recanted both of these concepts. This is a more remarkable in that they had a thoroughly sound psychological basis. We will not be back for a while. Okay. Oh, wrong one. We are here. Okay. Its darkness was so loaded with unconscious contents that a state of participation mystique, or unconscious identity, arose between them and the chemical substance, which caused the substance to behave, at any rate in part, like an unconscious content. Of this relationship, the alchemists had a dim presentiment, enough anyway to enable them to make statements which can only be understood as psychological. Cunroth says, "And the light was made salt, a body of salt, the salt of wisdom." Now, again, the salt and the body would be the same, and the body is composed from the logos. From the spirit came the body. This incorporation is completely composed of the light. And so this is not contradictory. This is an explanation. The light was made salt, given corporality, a body of salt. And then the salt was given wisdom. That would be the soul. The same author remarks that the point in the midst of the salt corresponds to the Tartarus of the greater world, which is hell. And no, it's not, right? Hell is the ever-burning fires of condemnation that awaits those who do not accept the redemption of Jesus Christ exclusively, right? Not Judaism, not Buddhism. Hell as the concept is entirely Christian. It may have its foundations over in India. That is entirely likely, even probable, but it is not an Old Testament concept at all, right? Tartarus, that was Greek. Their concept of hell was not the eternal burning condemnation either. That is a Eurocentric, Christianity-centered viewpoint that has got no real bearing in reality whatsoever. This coincides with the conception of the fire hidden in the salt. Salt must have a paradoxical double nature of the arcane substance. Thus, the Gloria Mundi says that in the salt are two salts, namely sulfur and the radical moisture. Again, sulfur is going to be the spirit. Radical moisture would be the spirit in motion, right, at best. And so that is not the opposites that is actually being intimated here. And again, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the difference between body, soul, and spirit. So the two most potent opposites imaginable, for which reason it was also called the rebus. Vigenaris asserts that salt consists of two substances, since all salts partake of sulfur and quicksilver. That is not true at all. Sodium hydrochloride has neither sulfur nor mercury. Now, we add mercury, right? Iodine is a form of mercury. We add that to salt. Iodized salt is a thing that we add, but it is not natural to it. Right? Go see if sea salt contains the iodine. These correspond to Cunroth's king and queen, the two watas, red and white. And for me, that is black and white. Right? It is easy to understand why red would be misattributed. We have discussed that at some length, but black and white would be the two waters, which is the representative of soul in this particular instance, and that is also king and queen. During the work, the salt assumes the appearance of blood. It is certain, says Dorn, that a salt, the natural balsam of the body, is begotten from human blood. No, it is not. It has within it both corruption and preservation against corruption. That is true, for in the natural order there is nothing that does not contain as much evil as good. That is true as well. Dorn was a physician, and his remark is characteristic of the empirical standpoint of the alchemist. And we're still not there. The dark nature of salt accounts for its blackness and fetid smell. At the dissolution of living bodies, it is the last residue of corruption, but it is the prime agent in generation. Mylius expressly identifies salt with the Ouroboros dragon. Now the Ouroboros is the cycle of continuation. Right? When you are done with your corporeality, other things will take those elements and incorporate them into itself. Most namely, the things that live inside you first. Right? You have an entire biome inside of you. If you were unaware of that, you should definitely investigate it. But there are bacteria and viruses that are within you that digest your food, they carry enzymes. There's all kinds of things that they do. Whenever you are done with this temple and your salt is no longer filled with the water, then it is reassimilated into nature, and that would be the Ouroboros, right? The never-ending cycle of renewal. We have already mentioned its identification with the Sea of Typhon, hence one could easily identify it with the sea monster Leviathan. 673. I cannot ever recall having come across this association in the text. Yeah, I bet you haven't. At all events, there is an amusing relationship between salt and the Leviathan in Abraham Eleazar, who says with reference to Job 40:15, that is the next footnote, that is just a reference to something else. At all events, who says with reference to Job, for Behemoth is a wild ox, whom the Most High has salted up with Leviathan, and preserved for the world to come. That has a footnote, 675. Oraltes Chemicus Rec. Work. The story is told in abbreviated form in the Babylonian Talmud, Baba Bathra. All that the Holy One, blessed be He, created in this world, He created male and female. Likewise Leviathan, the slant serpent, and Leviathan, the tortuous serpent, He created male and female. And had they mated with one another, they would have destroyed the whole world. What then did the Holy One, blessed be He, do? He castrated the male and killed the female, preserving it in salt for the righteousness in the world to come. For it is written, and He will slay the dragon that is in the sea. There was no need for Him to create the dragon if He was by necessity going to kill it. And if He was ignorant of the fact that He would need to kill it, that is a whole different problem. He is also said to have done the same thing to Behemoth. By way of explanation, I would like to add that the two prehistoric animals, Leviathan, water, and Behemoth, land, together with their females form a quartino of opposites. The conjunctio oppositorum on the animal level. An example in the unconscious state is prevented by God as being dangerous, for it would keep consciousness on the animal level and hinder its further development. Regarding the connection between salt and the female element, it is significant that it was the female Leviathan who was salted. It's not actually significant at all. Evidently as food for the inhabitants of paradise. Preserved for the world to come, evidently as food for the inhabitants of paradise, or whatever the world to come may mean. Footnote 676. According to an old tradition, God, after the fall, moved paradise and placed it into the future. That is dumb. Another direful aspect of salt is its relation to the malefic Saturn, as is implied by Gracius in that passage about the white dove in the philosophical lead. Speaking of the identity of sea and salt, Vigenerus points out that the Pythagoreans called the sea the tear of Kronos because of its bitter saltiness. 677. Plutarch, Isis and Osiris. The saying of the Pythagoreans, that the sea is a tier of Kronos. On account of its relation to Typhon, salt is also endowed with a murderous quality. 678. The Gnostic view that Kronos is a power of the color of water and all destructive, Hippolytus Alentios. For further associations of the bright water, see the spirit Mercurius. Also endowed with a murderous quality, as we saw in the chapter on sulfur, where Sal inflicts on sulfur an incurable wound. This offers a curious parallel to Kundry's wounding of Amfortas and Parzival. In the parable of sulfur, Sal pays the sinister new moon role of Luna. As a natural product, salt contains as much evil as good. As the sea is the mother of all things, as the tear of Kronos, it is bitterness and sadness. As the sea spume, it is the scum of Typhon. And as the clear water, it is Sapentia herself. The Gloria Mundi says that the aqua permanens is a very limpid water, so bitter as to be quite undrinkable. In a hymn-like invocation, the text continues, O water of bitter taste, that preservest the elements, O nature of propinquity, that dissolvest nature, O best of natures which overcomest nature herself, thou art crowned with light and art born, and the quintessence arises from thee. Footnote, no, we're not there yet. This water is like none on earth, with the exception that the fountain Judea, which is named the fount of the Savior, or of blessedness, with great efforts, and by the grace of God the philosophers found that noble spring. But the spring is in a place so secret that only a few know of its gushing, and they know not the way to Judea where it might be found. That is Judea as the allegory for inner exploration, that is not Judea the physicality place. Therefore the philosopher cries out. Footnote 681. Morianus, in whose treatise is found only the expression blessed water, then the idea of the one fount of the four qualities, and finally the important remark that no one attains the completion of the work save by the affliction of the soul, that is, shadow work. Right? You only achieve the completion of the work by afflicting your soul, by understanding the things that afflict your soul. Therefore the philosopher cries out, O water of harsh and bitter taste, for it is hard and difficult for any man to find that spring. 682, I think, was just a reference to something else. Yes. This is an obvious allusion to the arcane nature and moral significance of the water, and it is also evident that it is not the water of grace, or the water of the doctrine, but that it springs from the lumen naturae. Otherwise, the author would not have emphasized that Judea was in a secret place. For if the church's teachings were meant, no one would need to find them in a secret place, since they are accessible to everyone. Also, it would be quite incomprehensible why the philosopher should exclaim, O water held worthless by all, by reason of its worthlessness and tortuousness. 683. Curvitatem, presumably an allusion to the winding course of water and the rivulae, streams, of the mercurial serpent. By reason of its worthlessness and tortuousness, no one can attain perfection in the arts, or perceive its mighty virtue, for all four elements are, as it were, contained in it. There can be no doubt that this is the aqua permanens, or aqua pontica, the primal water which contains the four elements. The psychological equivalent of the chaotic water of the beginning, 684, darkness there was, at first concealed in darkness, this all was undiscriminated chaos, Rig Veda. Right? That would be the void. All concealed in darkness would be the void. The psychological equivalent of the chaotic water of the beginning is the unconscious, which the old writers could grasp only in projected form, just as today most people cannot see the beam in their own eye, but are all too aware of the mote in their brother's. Political propaganda exploits this primitivity and conquers the naive with their own defect. The only defense against this overwhelming danger is recognition of the shadow. The sight of its darkness is itself an illumination, a widening of consciousness through integration of the hitherto unconscious components of the personality. Freud's efforts to bring the shadow to consciousness are the logical and salutary answer to the almost universal unconsciousness and projection proneness of the general public. It is as though Freud, with sheer instinct, had sought to avert the danger of nationwide psychic epidemics that threatened Europe. What he did not see was that the confrontation with the shadow is not just a harmless affair that can be settled by reason. The shadow is the primitive, who is still alive and active in civilized man, and our civilized reason means nothing to him. He needs to be ruled by a higher authority, such as is found in the great religions. Yes and no, right? There needs to be the higher authority. I use God himself with none of the religions. And the argument can be made that I am on a higher, more attainable path than most of the people that actually wrote these books. And again, I know that sounds prideful, but it is not meant that way. Even when reason triumphed at the beginning of the French Revolution, it was quickly turned into a goddess and enthroned in Notre Dame. There was something in that church. The shadow exerts a dangerous fascination which can be countered only by another fascinosum. It cannot be got at by reason, even in the most rational person. I disagree heartily. But only by illumination of a degree and kind that are equal to the darkness but are the exact opposite of enlightenment. That is the exploration of the shadow self, right? I do believe that that is a logical process, right? It is brought about by feelings, but the assimilation comes through the logical understanding of those feelings. And so I disagree with this, right? I do believe that it can be got at. The shadow does exert a dangerous fascination. That is true. And you can, through illumination, which is the process of wisdom, right? Illumination is both a divine revelation and your ability to cognate. And so I do believe that it is entirely possible to achieve that, but it is also by doing the exact opposite, right? If you are feeling wrath, you should try to understand kindness or love. Either one will get you there. Kindness is the balance. Love is the other extremity. It is through that shadow work that we achieve the illumination in toto. And so I do disagree with that. For what we call rational is everything that seems fitting to the man in the street. That is not necessarily intrinsic. And the question then arises whether this fitness may not in the end prove to be irrational in the bad sense of the word, right? The man in the street is not a source of wisdom. It's really not. The man in the street has a tendency to be consumed by the darkness, totally subsumed by their shadow self, and therefore they are not to be the example for anything. Right? The exception makes the rule, right? Being the exception from the masses is where the things get worked out. And so applying rationality to the common denominator of man is kind of a misappropriation. The common denominator of man is misunderstanding. It is not having cognition. And if you don't believe that, then, right, mob mentality is a very real thing. Whenever a group of people get together, they will act in accordance with whatever the situation is. We see that with all of these idiots out there throwing riots behind things that they do not truly understand in the slightest. And from the time, like, they can be out there peacefully protesting. But when the first person throws the first stone, everybody else devolves too. That mob mentality is the opposite of rationality and therefore should not be attributed to the masses at all. Is it possible for rational actions to come from the masses? Yeah, but it has to be quite intentional. It is not going to be the unconscious function at all. Sometimes, even with the best intentions, this dilemma cannot be solved. This is the moment when the primitive trusts himself to a higher authority and to a decision beyond his comprehension. The civilized man in his closed-in environment functions in a fitting and appropriate manner, that is, rationally. But if, because of some apparently insoluble dilemma, he gets outside of the confines of civilization, he becomes a primitive again. See that mob mentality. Then he has irrational ideas and acts on hunches. Then he no longer thinks, but it thinks in him. Then he needs magical practices in order to gain a feeling of security. Then the latent autonomy of the unconscious becomes active and begins to manifest itself as it has always done in the past. I practice magic, but it is on the other side of the functions, right? It is through the logical processes that I am able to do that. It is not because of them, right? And so I don't need the magical practices to gain the feeling. I can do the magic because I have the feeling. The good tidings announced by alchemy are that, as once a fountain sprang up in Judea, so now there is a secret Judea, the way to which is not easily found, and a hidden spring whose waters seem so worthless. 685. We missed a couple, right? Curvatatium, presumably an allusion to the winding course of the water in the rivuli. I think we did that one. Darkness was there, at first concealed in darkness. This all was undiscriminated chaos. Actually, we did that one too, okay. Velitas was also something Christ was reproached with. Can there any good thing come out of Nazareth? And a hidden spring whose waters seem so worthless and so bitter that they are deemed of no use at all. We know from numerous hints, footnote 686, Psychology and Alchemy, numerous hints that man's inner life is the secret place where the aqua solvens and coagulans, the medicina catholica, or panacea, the spark of the light of nature, are to be found. 687, or as Marinius so graphically says, until it begins to shine like fish's eyes. Our text shows us how much the alchemists put their art on the level of divine revelation and regarded it as at least an essential complement to the work of redemption. True, only a few of them were the elect who formed the golden chain linking earth to heaven, but still they were the fathers of natural science today. And again, I agree, right? There are some good books, but there are many not, and only the elect form the golden chain. They were the unwitting instigators of the schism between faith and knowledge, and it was they who made the world conscious that the revelation was neither complete nor final. Since these things are so, says an ecclesiastic of the 17th century, it will suffice after the light of faith for human ingenuity to recognize, as it were, the refracted rays of the divine majesty in the world and the created things. 688. Casson. The refracted rays correspond to the sudden luminosity, which the alchemist said was inherent in the natural world. That is the inner light that I talk about so often. Revelation conveys general truths which do not illuminate the individual's actual situation in the slightest. Nor was it traditional revelation that gave us the microscope and the machine. Wasn't it, though? Wasn't it a flash of inspiration that came along and suddenly we had the ability to understand that we can make this thing? Was that not a divine inspiration? Was that not? Okay, I believe that it was. I believe that every innovation came through the spark of divine inspiration. I fully and firmly believe that. I will stand upon that. Every single instance of every entertainment ever created was also an equal inspiration. Whether it was a factual or unfactual, whether it was fiction or nonfiction, whether it contained truth or not, even Agrippa serves a purpose. And since human life is not enacted exclusively, or even to a noticeable degree, on the plane of the higher verities, the source of knowledge unlocked by the old alchemists and physicians has done humanity a great and welcome service. So great that for many people the light of revelation has been extinguished altogether. Within the confines of civilization, man's willful rationality apparently suffices. Outside of this he shines, or should shine, the light of faith. But where the darkness comprehendeth it not, this being the prerogative of darkness, those laboring in the darkness must try to accomplish an opus that will cause the fish's eyes to shine in the depths of the sea, or to catch the refracted rays of the divine majesty, even though this produces a light which the darkness, as usual, does not comprehend. But when there is a light in the darkness which comprehends the darkness, darkness no longer prevails. The longing of the darkness for light is fulfilled only when the light can no longer be rationally explained by the darkness. For the darkness has its own peculiar intellect and its own logic, which should be taken very seriously. Only the light which the darkness comprehendeth not can illuminate the darkness. Everything that the darkness thinks, grasps, and comprehends by itself is dark. Therefore, it is illuminated only by what, to it, is unexpected, unwanted, and incomprehensible. The psychotherapeutic method of active imagination offers excellent examples of this. Sometimes a numinous dream or some external event will have the same effect. Alchemy announced a source of knowledge, parallel if not equivalent to revelation, which yields a bitter water by no means acceptable to our human judgment. It is harsh and bitter, or like vinegar. 689. Mire. This is in our chemistry a sudden noble substance, in the beginning whereof its wretchedness with vinegar, but ending with joy and gladness. And so I have supposed it will fail with me, that at first I shall taste, suffer, and experience much difficulty, bitterness, grief, and weariness, but in the end shall come to glimpse pleasanter and easier things. It is harsh and bitter like vinegar, for it is a bitter thing to accept the darkness and blackness of the umbra solis, and to pass through this valley of shadow. It is bitter, indeed, to discover behind one's lofty ideals narrow, fanatical convictions, all the more cherished for that, and behind one's heroic pretensions nothing but crude egotism, infantile greed, and complacency. This painful corrective is an unavoidable stage in every psychotherapeutic process. As the alchemist says, it begins with the negretto. It generates it as the indispensable prerequisite for synthesis. For unless the opposites are constellated and brought to consciousness, they can never be united. And again, I raise the book for a reason. Freud halted the process at the reduction of the inferior half of the personality, and tended to overlook the demonic dangerousness of the dark side, which by no means consists only of relatively harmless infantilisms. Man is neither so reasonable nor so good that he can cope ep ipso with evil. The darkness can quite well engulf him, especially when he finds himself with those of like mind. Mass-mindedness increases unconsciousness, and then the evil swells like an avalanche, as contemporary events have shown. Even so, society can also work for good. It is even necessary because of the moral weakness of most human beings, who, to maintain themselves at all, must have some external good to cling on to. The great religions are psychotherapeutic systems that give a foothold to all those who cannot stand by themselves, and they are in the overwhelming majority. In spite of their undoubtedly heretical methods, the alchemists showed by their positive attitude to the church that they were cleverer than certain modern apostles of enlightenment. That would include me, right? Because all of my methods are heretical, I do not stand with a positive attitude towards the church. You may find value in the church if you are one of these overwhelming majority, right? God will find you where you are, but the church contains things which will intentionally lead you away from enlightenment. And so I do not have a positive attitude of the church in general at all. Also, very much in contrast to the rationalistic tendencies of today, they displayed, despite its tortuousness, a remarkable understanding of the imagery upon which the Christian cosmos is built. This world of images, in its historical form, is irretrievably lost to modern man. Its loss has spiritually impoverished the masses and compelled them to find pitiful substitutes as poisonous as they are worthless. Agreed. See this entire study on salt, right? That is because of losing those symbols, right? That is because of the not understanding what the symbols actually meant. We can find real values for those symbols in some of these texts. Some of them we cannot. Using salt as the soul is one of those cannots. No one can be held responsible for this development. It is due rather to the restless tempo of spiritual growth and change, whose motive forces go far beyond the horizon of the individual. He can only hope to keep pace with it and try to understand it so far that he is not blindly swallowed up by it. For that is the alarming thing about mass movements, even if they are good, that they demand and must demand blind faith. The church can never explain the truth of her images because she acknowledges no point of view but her own. She moves solely within the framework of her images, and her arguments must always beg the question. The flock of harmless sheep was ever the symbolic prototype of the credulous crowd. Though the church is quick to recognize the wolves in sheep's clothing who lead the faith of the multitude astray in order to destroy them, the tragedy is that the blind trust, which leads to perdition, is practiced just as much inside the church and is praised as the highest virtue. Yes. Yet our Lord says, "Be ye therefore ever wise as serpents," 690. Matthew 10:16. And the Bible itself stresses the cleverness and cunningness of the serpent. And where are these necessary, if not altogether praiseworthy qualities, developed and given their due? The serpent has become a byword for everything morally abhorrent, and yet anyone who is not as smart as a snake is liable to land himself in trouble through blind faith. The alchemist knew about the snake and the cold half of nature. Footnote 691. Hippolytus reports the following saying of the Periatics. The universal serpent is the wise word of Eve. This was the mystery and the river of paradise and the sign that protected Cain so that no one should kill him, for the god of this world had not accepted his offering. That is an interesting turn of phrase. The god of where? The god of this world. Interesting. This god reminds us very much of the prince of this world in St. John. Among the Periatics, it was naturally the demiurge, the father below. Right. The cold half of nature, and they said enough to make it clear to their successors that they endeavored by their art to lead that serpentine noose of the darkness, the sapens mercialis, through the stages of transformation to the goal of perfection. Telesmus 692 is, this is the father of all perfection, Rusca, tabulus magna. Looks like we're at the end. The more or less symbolical or projected integration of the unconscious that went hand in hand with this evidently had so many favorable effects that the alchemist felt encouraged to express a tempered optimism. And that is going to bring us to the end of our exploration of salt. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to some very difficult series of topics. I understand I hold some unconventional beliefs, and I do have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something that I apologize for. It is why I point out them playlists so very often. Most of this has been colored by the misunderstanding of what salt is supposed to represent. Salt is supposed to be the corporeality. It is the part that carries out what the spirit actually does, right? The spirit makes it happen. It is the electrical impulse. It is the agent of change. It is all heat, light, motion, all thought even, right? The ability to change your thoughts is a function of the logos, but you use the logos. You are composed entirely of the logos, but you are not the logos in its entirety. Every single part of you is made up from that spirit, but it is the salt, not the spirit. The soul resides within the salt, but the soul is not the salt either. That is a fundamental misunderstanding that is repeated throughout most of these texts. I will go as far, even though I have not done the study of most of the texts, to say that it is most of them. The true understanding is going to be the harder one to come to. That is not necessarily intrinsic, right? But there is so much obfuscation from the control systems that it gets a little bit murky. What we saw with Eliphas Levi, and this is my interpretation of that book, right? Dogma and Ritual. He was on the road to become a priest, and then he left the priesthood, and he wrote this book of wisdom that did not really contain that much wisdom. I believe that he was an agent for the church, intentionally obfuscating the information that he was relaying so that you would not be able to achieve actual enlightenment or do any of the manifestation processes, which you would be able to do if he had the understanding or related correctly. Now, I believe that he was intentionally aligned against that he was intentionally aligned with obfuscation. That became apparent to me from his own words in his own work. What I am trying to do over here is to clear up those confusions, right? The body is the salt, the sulfur is the spirit, and the mercury is the part that makes the decisions. That is, fire is the sulfur, air or water can be the soul, right? Or fire or water can be the spirit. Now, that is in very specific contexts. The actual is fire. The spirit, or the spirit united with the body, would be represented by water. The body itself is going to be earth. And then the fire is the change. So hopefully I brought enough enlightenment. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this one up. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow, throw me a comment whether you agree or disagree with anything that was stated. Put it in the box down below, and if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you really like what I'm doing over here, hit me with that super thanks. Consider joining for a membership, picking up a copy of my book, or consulting me directly through Connect. If you really, really like what I'm doing over here, hit me with that hype button. It is free, and it will help the channel immensely. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt State. Peace.